Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddy Network podcast. My guest today is Jerrold McGrath, and he is the author of a very interesting book called In Praise of Disorder. I hope you can read that title. I like this cover, and it's a fascinating. It's not simply a book of text. It's a book of disruption. So welcome, Jerrold, and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've been doing, how did you end up writing this book, and whatever else you want to tell us. I mean, it's all fair game.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for having me. This is wonderful. So yeah, my name is Jerrold McGrath, and I suppose to explain the book, it might be helpful to provide just a bit of context about how I got to where I am. I spent about 8 or 9 years working at a place here in Canada. I'm currently in Toronto, Ontario, but I used to live in Banff National Park, which is a beautiful place in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And there's a center there called the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. And I was a program director there for a number of years. And one of my responsibilities was to work with different groups that had sort of intransigent cycles of opposition or conflict, and that were stuck in routines that weren't particularly helpful. And so how do we create the conditions for them to move through those sort of obstacles or barriers in order to accomplish something new? And so for folks who don't know, Alberta is the home of the oil sands. So there's a huge petrochemical industry there. There's also a large number of Indigenous communities that have traditionally, currently, and in the future called Alberta home, including the Stoney Nakoda and different Blackfoot nations. We have obviously environmental groups, and the Banff Centre focuses on artists and community groups and social activists. And so all these communities, they come into conflict. And so part of my role there was to figure out how do we create conditions for folks to talk to each other and to work together. And I worked a lot with artists, and artists are sort of wonderful at creating the conditions for new things to emerge. And so borrowing some practices from the arts, and myself, I'm a practicing artist myself, we developed approaches that could be repeated over time in order to break up sort of ossified routines that were preventing new things from getting done. And so that was the derivation of the book.
That's very cool. I've been to Banff. And
oh, it's a beautiful place, isn't it? It's unbelievable.
It's an extraordinary place.
Yeah.
It's if there's a place in North America that you could call mystical, it would be Banff.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is part of it. Sorry, go ahead.
And I lived in Wyoming. I lived in Jackson Hole for almost 6 years. So it's another place like that. But Banff is kind of a cut above. It's for some reason, I don't know.
Yeah, well, they say it's a thin space, like it's a space that's pretty close to whatever else there might be. And so being there, like in the book, I talk a lot about awe and wonder as being ways of sort of breaking up the categories that we apply to experience. And Banff is such a great environment for that, because people come, they show up, they look around, and whatever they were going to say, it seems to slip right out of their mind, because they're just so overwhelmed by the mountains. They're overwhelmed by the beauty of the space they're in. And that's a real opening, right? Like it's an opening that's inherent to the place. And so it made our work a lot easier. We just sort of had to bring people there, and then they could slip into this sense of not knowing how things are supposed to work.
That's very, very interesting. So this idea that you have in the book about disruption, where did that idea come from?
So the story that sort of like anchors the book is the story of UKAI, and UKAI is it's spelled UKAI. It's a form of fishing that is popular in different parts of the world, but the name UKAI comes from Japan. And I lived in Japan for a number of years. I was a trainer in the automotive industry there. I was doing relocation training, and I was invited to go out and see this practice, UKAI. And you go down to the river at night. This is in Gifuken in central Japan, in Honshu. And there's these burning baskets of pine that are attached to boats, and they're over the river. And these fish, they're kind of ayu, they're called. They're They're kind of freshwater small fish. And they come up to the surface drawn by the light. And then around the boat, there are these cormorants, which are these big black sort of oil birds. And they have metal rings around their neck. And so the cormorants, they gobble up the fish, but they can't swallow because they have this ring around their neck. And then the people in the boat, they bring the birds in and they flip them upside down and they dump the fish into a bucket. And then the community, the village, they eat these fish that are caught in this way. And the first time I saw it, I didn't know what to do. Like I had never seen anything like it. It wasn't what I expected. This was like pre-internet, so I couldn't do my research before showing up. And like to my regret, I kind of judged it. I said, well, it's a bit cruel, isn't it? And the friend that brought me, they kind of gave me this look I couldn't interpret. And then later in reflecting on it, I was like, well, why was I in such a rush to make a decision that this was like good or bad, or this was healthy or unhealthy? You know, why couldn't I just let that moment be open? And so it became something that sort of stuck with me. And so it became the name of a nonprofit that I'm now involved with. But it also became this sort of anchor for how do we create these experiences that ask people to be uncertain about what they're supposed to do and that defy the categories we use to apply to experience. And so the book is, I mean, the first bit of the book is sort of an exploration of how we got to this place, like historically, why are we so preoccupied with order and control? And then the second half is really exploring different practices based on people I've worked with over time that allow us to sort of be more open to our categories being reworked. And I want to say, like, organizations, communities, like we ossify these structures because it makes sense to do so. Like we are overwhelmed every day with sort of media and content and other sort of messages. And so we have to create these structures and systems to be able to create, you know, to be able to function. But sometimes those categories, they stop working for us. And so how do we rework them over time? And how do we notice the fact that our ways of thinking and our patterns of thinking have become rigid or ossified? And so that's the sort of the second half of the book, is exploring those approaches and in sort of personal practices we can bring to that over time.
So when you're talking about structure kind of becoming this dominant force that is the obstacle to everything else, am I correct in kind of defining it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm anti-structure. I think it's when we apply a sort of, when order becomes a moral good, like when structure and certainty becomes, it sort of takes on the strength of a moral position, that's when it gets a little bit dangerous. And I think part of that is because we don't, like, I have a daughter, she's 14. And I used to imagine the future would be better than the present, you know, and that I could anticipate for her a better future. I don't know if that promise I can keep anymore. And so when you feel like the future may not be better than the present, what do? Well, you want to make sure that you're avoiding the worst possible futures. And so control becomes this rational way of dealing with it. And there's scarcity, so efficiency becomes the rational way to deal with that. But efficiency and control are not maybe universally useful. So when we have structures of efficiency and control in place, in situations in which efficiency and control maybe aren't the right solution, that's really where I want to do my work. Like I love order. I like certainty around certain aspects of my life, but I don't want to apply that to everything, because then I start missing out on opportunities to sort of be with other people or to experience compassion or joy or conviviality, because I'm only worried about, you know, what I'm supposed to do in that moment, or what's the most efficient way to sort of navigate the situation that I found myself in.
See, I see what faces your daughter at 14 is an opportunity that my children, who are now in their 30s, they're twice as old as she is, almost 3 times as old as she is, didn't have, which was the kind of the emptying of all these support structures so that they really have to work to create them themselves. And the beauty of that is that they learn who they are, and they learn to contribute, and they learn that they have to build these relationships, all these things that you're writing about in the book, things that I write about in my work, that they have the opportunity to do that which maybe you and I didn't have the opportunity to do when we because it was already done for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I like talking to people, who are in their teens and their early 20s for that very reason, to say you have an opportunity that no one else who's alive has ever had.
Yeah, they can reimagine, or they can begin the process of building, in my case, culture is what I'm interested in, but the culture for what's coming. And I guess we just need to be able to develop the capacity. Like, so there was a Spanish philosopher named Ortega y Gasset, and he was writing in the 20s, and he wrote a lot about shipwreck and this idea that being human means like sort of being in shipwreck, and culture is just us swimming. And so, but the problem is after 200 years of building this sort of boat, or in his case, he's talking about thousands of years, you forget what it's like to be in the water. And so how do we create conditions for, like, my daughter, for us to remember what it's like to be in the water again and not to be safe in the boat, without having to burn the boat? Because this is something that you want to sort of build some tolerance over time. And so it's really a sort of a gradual approach. But like, my daughter is not being prepared to thrive in uncertainty, right? Like, she's through social media and like through educational systems, she's being fit into sort of categories that probably aren't appropriate anymore. Or she's being asked to have strong opinions about things when strong opinions maybe aren't going to be all that helpful for her, because she's going to have to work with people with different opinions. And so I mean, yes, I agree. The opportunity for her is exciting to create that future. But there's work to be done to be okay sort of in that uncertainty while we're building it.
Well, I guess we have to model that.
Yeah.
As their parents, and in some cases as their grandparents, because I think that's the challenge, is that we're living in a world that's in tremendous transition, and in ways that nobody can calculate at this point. The disruption, In Praise of Disruption, is a great title because it describes where we are. And so how do you seek to convince people that this is not the end of the world, but just the transition to the next world?
Yeah. Well, I think design is a big part of it. You'll notice in the book there's a lot of sort of designers that are invited into conversation, because they can create those conditions that surface, like, without scaring away. They can really invite people into uncertainty in a way that's playful or generous or compassionate. And then people are like, okay, I can deal with this. And maybe they'll go a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper. It's when we're sort of thrust into it that things can feel very chaotic. When we don't have a choice in the sort of the disorder that we're in, that's when it can feel particularly difficult to navigate. And so it's about like building that muscle up over time. Like, maybe I'll do a small thing today, and then tomorrow I'll do a little more, and then the day after that I'll do a little more, so that when something big does happen, that I can actually cope with that.
You have created not just one organization, you've created several, right?
Yeah.
And you're operating them all at the same time. Am I correct in that?
A little bit less now. UKAI has really taken up a lot of the focus. I've been doing a lot less sort of consulting work, although I still do some. Obviously the writing as well. I'm involved with the BMW Foundation, the Responsible Leaders Network. But in terms of I tend to always have one project and then a project on the side of my desk that's the next thing. Which that sort of impatience maybe is also a symptom for why I ended up writing the book that I did. But
so tell us about your UKAI organization, and what's its purpose, and what's its program look like, and what is the impact that you're seeking to create?
Sure, yeah. So UKAI is there's three of us on the core team now, and we work with about 8 or 10 other folks around the world. A lot of the work is around taking technologies that are being developed and deployed with particular values at the center, and then putting them over to other purposes. So right now, AI is at the center of our work, artificial intelligence, deeply interested in the implications of that. I think there's a lot of positive things that can come out of AI and reworking our social and economic systems. I think there's a lot of risks as well. So we're really interested in that. And we do like sort of simple interventions. So we have a project called AI Ritual that we'll be bringing to Scotland next month, but it started in Berlin in Germany. And people come up on stage and there's a table, and then there's two of sort of our specialists that are at the table. And people are then invited to provide, like, to basically share their hopes and fears with an AI system. And the AI system lives for 90 minutes. It dies at the end of 90 minutes. But before it goes, it tries to generate its own hope, its own fear, shares it with the room, and then we pull the plug. And so it's this really simple sort of encounter with an idea that we have sort of these abstract, like it's like knowing about fire and then being burned, like they're very different experiences. And so we're trying to give people like that exposure where like, oh, actually this thing is ridiculous, or it's really actually quite intimate talking to it in this way, or it feels very scary, or it doesn't feel scary, but really trying to provide people with a direct experience of the thing. And so that's some of the work. We're developing a project called Restructuring Futures, which is essentially it's a collaboration platform for people that want to do things in the world, but are dealing with technical volatility. So essentially, like if you're in a place where your government doesn't want you talking to certain people, if you're using the standard web, you can be restricted. If you're dealing with a lot of climate issues, or you're dealing with a lot of infrastructure issues, you don't have a reliable internet connection or server connection. So we're working with this protocol that's extremely resilient to volatility. And so as a collaboration tool, it's not, I mean, it's nothing unique. There are amazing collaboration tools out there, but it's set up to be resilient to shocks. And even though people may not be experiencing those shocks now, the sort of the platform itself is a reminder that those shocks may be present for people you're working with, and they may be present for you down the line. So it's just an invitation to sort of reflect on the potential volatility in a world where you and I can talk like this across countries with ease. But that may not always be the case. And it may not always be the case for everyone. Like it's not sort of evenly distributed, these opportunities for these types of conversations.
So a shock could be loss of power.
Yep.
Loss of internet.
Yeah, we had a Bangladeshi collaborator where the heat was so hot that their systems wouldn't run. Like they couldn't get access to their systems. And so what do you do? Or their local internet would go down because they just couldn't cool it at an adequate level.
So what is it that you, what kind of resilient systems do you create to counter those shocks?
So in this case, it's the protocol is super decentralized. So you have a lot of agency in what information is stored locally, and there is no central server. So if an agent like a government or whatever wanted to go after the central server, there isn't one. And so I guess it's not blockchain because it's not that kind of technology, but some of the underlying assumptions are similar to what blockchain would be, in that in decentralizing, it allows for the system eventually to be coherent and consistent and resilient. It may just take time. And this could work with a USB stick. Like I could give you my USB stick with my sort of memory of our collaborative space. You plug that in, and then the system is sort of back online again. It can be transmitted through radio. Like we've got it so you can hook up to a Tesla, like a sort of a Raspberry Pi type system, have a local server to coordinate. So even if there's no power and there's no internet, you can still collaborate across a fairly large distance. And it's not practical, it's not efficient. Like at the moment, it doesn't make sense. But as an artistic project, as an infrastructure project, it does, because we imagine the future will be different. And even by doing this, hopefully we're asking people to say, hey, like, do you want that future? Do you think it's likely? You know, maybe let's reflect on the choices we're making right now.
You find that you found pushback from what you're doing?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think, and I quite rightly, right? Like I think order and disorder is a funny thing, right? Like what may feel like if I'm at a restaurant and I see kids screaming and running around, I'm used to that. Like, you know, it bothers me a little bit, but it doesn't feel overwhelming. But for some people, they can't deal with it. They don't know what to do.
You
Yeah.
adapt.
Yeah, or you don't, right? Or you complain to the manager. And so I think the more we have invested in how things are, the more disorder is scary. And so if you're sort of a beneficiary of the current system, you're sort of where that dial hits dangerous is different than for folks that don't have as much to lose. So definitely, yeah, we get pushback.
So would you say that the trend line is towards greater decentralization?
I think in some cases, like I think things like energy, like I think there are certain aspects of our like techno-social systems that need central systems. They need central organizing. I think the challenge is when we apply that across the board.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know that healthcare, for example, needs to be hyper centralized. Like and I'm in Canada where we have sort of state medicine. And it doesn't always serve interests, right? You're not actually often getting the kind of care you need at a local level, especially when 90% of like healthcare is delivered by friends and neighbors. Like it's not institutionalized healthcare that's doing the work. And so I think applying the logic of like oil and gas to health is where it gets dangerous, because like different needs have different sort of solutions. But we've sort of elevated efficiency and scale and size as being a moral good. And if you do something that's like intentionally inefficient, people like it. I don't know. Like again, an example I like to give in Canada now, we have a lot of these like automated tellers. So you don't have to talk to a person. Like you can run your food through, and that's great. Like if that's what you want. But there are people that like want and need to talk to someone when they're buying their whatever it is they're buying. And I think when we're in line, sometimes we can get frustrated when the person in front of us or two people in front of us wants to talk to the person. And that worries me. Like someone's need for sociality, for human contact, to feel less lonely is a violation of my need for efficiency. And I'm angry at that person for like, and to me, like their need to not feel so alone should probably be more important than my need to get out of there quickly. But I don't know that we're always good at remembering that. We sort of value efficiency as a desired, as the end. And other needs are sort of downstream from that. And I'd like to see that in some contexts, at least, some reversed.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's certainly what I've been seeing. I have a little framework I call the two global forces. And there's a global force of centralized governance and finance, and a global force of decentralized networks of relationships. And I see that the networks of relationships are ascending because the institutional structures are not capable of taking care of us any longer.
Yep.
And you call a customer service rep, on the phone. I had this situation with a insurance company that I had an annuity with, and they lost my account. And I would call them and I'd say, I need to change my address. Well, we don't have an account with you. Well, yes, you do. and, and it took 4 years to get it figured out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you say, and I think that was a problem where efficiency overruled the customer service mandate to care for your customer. And that's what I saw. And we've now resolved that. And and it's now we fine. I don't know if we're fine, but the issue has been resolved. And they know I exist. They have a new address, all of that. But you see, I think that's part of what we're dealing with. And it's kind of a clash of cultures that goes on. And to me, the challenge is not what is my culture and what is your culture, but how can we meet? How can we find some common ground for conversation? And what I find, and this is why I'm doing this podcast, so I want to talk to people all over the world, and what I discover is that we have far much more that is similar to us globally than that is dissimilar.
Yeah.
And it's it's fascinating to me to talk to people, you know, from Africa, Asia, Europe, Canada, South America. I mean, and anywhere in the United States, and find, you know, common ground, you know, where we've never had a conversation before, but already we're into a conversation that has a connection where there's something meaningful, and maybe out of this comes something where we can contribute to each other's work, or at least support each other in some way. And that to me is an essential thing that has to be communicated to people and given them the experience of having that kind of encounter with people.
Yeah, I think there's in the book I mentioned, there's a Michelle Wright, who's a professor in the US, and she writes about time being ice melting outwards. This idea of you put a piece of ice on the top of a hill and you let it melt, and then the water will flow as the surface of the mountain allows for it. And our experience of events is really based on, you know, where we are on that mountain. And what our experiences will be is and we assume we have sort of shared stories, and we do. We all have shared desires for the world we want to live in. We talk about our kids, you know, we talk about subsequent generations. But we're just drawing attention to the fact that we also have different, oh geez, getting a bit blurry here. There we are. We have different starting points, right? We're on different points of the surface of the mountain. And I think that's where often where those differences can sort of emerge. But if we only pay attention to that, then it's like, I want your spot or I want his spot. You know, it's all about who gets what. And I think there's other ways of sort of thinking about it.
So where did you start with all this? I mean, I know you were in Banff, but before that, what was your background that brought you into this kind of world that has allowed you to become a contributor in a way that a lot of people have never been? So you're kind of
I think it's been mostly accidental, but I studied environmental economics, and then I did some work. And actually, my sort of honors thesis was on the post-Soviet sort of resource allocations, like what happened to essentially how was the natural world divvied up after the collapse of state communism in the East. And that's, you know, my family's from that side, at least, is from Slovakia, so I had some sort of direct connection to those conversations. And then my master's is in strategic innovation and change, so a lot of organizational based work. When I was in Japan, I worked as a relocation trainer in the automotive industry, and that was a real wake up. Like, sort of, my job was basically to prepare people being relocated, often to Kentucky, but also to Bahrain and to other locations, and preparing them to manage non-Japanese staff. And so there was sort of this cultural, some language training, but also a lot of like cultural training as well. Or not really training, but you know what I mean, conversations about differences in culture. And then Banff I worked in leadership development, so I have a strong connection to the work that you're doing, and I have a deep appreciation for it. But because Banff is so centered in arts and culture, most of my work was leadership within the cultural sector. And so that became my area of interest. And then when I became program director there, we had just had the 2007, 2008, that economic collapse. And so our existing business models with corporate partners kind of fell apart. And so the question became, well, what do we do with the communities that call this place home? Like, how do we create a shared space for people to create together? Very lucky, I got to work with the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, former Prime Minister of Canada, to do like multidisciplinary cohorts of undergraduate students. I worked with sort of arts leaders from across the country. I got to do some really, really cool stuff. And then, since then, it's just made me curious about, all right, like, are the models we apply to the world helpful? Are the maps we have of how things are still true? Are we confusing the map with the terrain? Like, are we forgetting the ground under our feet? And so the work since Banff has really been directed at that.
Am I hearing some sort of skepticism towards the way we treat systems and the way we think about systems?
Yeah, I think it's more, how we think into systems sometimes. Like I think the process of mapping out systems is necessary. I think when we start confusing them, like when we start imagining that they are the reality, that's where it starts to get risky, because we've done the work of sort of objectifying difference, and we've created these models that provide us a useful map of the world around us. But we can't, like, that's not where we live. Like, we don't live in the map, we live in the world.
Yeah.
And I do find that, especially organizations, they can often be a bit myopic about when the map and the terrain don't line up. And they have people on the front lines that are like, if we keep going this way, we're going to go off a cliff. But no, the map says there's no cliff there, so just keep going. And so they don't always trust the eyes of the people that are sort of on the periphery of what the organization's trying to do.
You don't have to answer the question I'm about to ask, but I'm interested in how you view the future of Western governments.
No, it's a good question, and I'll say, like, in our work and in the book, we're sympathetic to sort of anarchist teachings and history, not in a sense that maybe most people might be familiar, but the idea that, all right, so there was a Roman Catholic priest named Ivan Illich who was writing in the 70s and 80s, wrote a book called Deschooling Society. He did a lot of, he was a fantastic thinker. He passed away, I think about 15, 20 years ago. And his argument was that this idea of grace, that we can choose who to love as our neighbor. Like, we can turn towards someone who's a stranger, someone we just met on the street, and provide care and love and compassion to them, that this is a gift.
Yeah.
And that institutions, they actually take away that gift.
Yeah.
Because that person on the street, I say, I don't need to help them because there's a hospital that's going to help them, or there's somebody's job to help them. And so I don't need to care about them anymore. And he said that that's a great loss for us. And so he believed that Western institutions writ large were a corruption of this idea of grace. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but I do feel that. I do feel like we often forego our responsibilities, or not even responsibilities, our potential for grace with other people, because it's somebody else's job. And actually in Canada, I don't know if it's the case there, like, you can actually get in trouble for doing something that's supposed to be another institution's job. And so we see this, like, with policing, where people don't settle their own differences. They rely on like law enforcement. We see this in medicine. We see this in all across the board. And so I do think that we have to recover this idea of grace. Like, we have to be able to give people opportunities to care for each other. Because if we don't, then the mistrust we have for these institutions is just going to grow. Because they're not doing the job that they're supposed to do, and two, they're taking away our ability to do that job for ourselves. And that combination, I don't think it can hold.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think David Cayley's work on Ivan Illich is really quite extraordinary and very underappreciated, I would say. Having begun my career as a Presbyterian minister, I come at this with sort of a divided feel of the institution of religion versus the community of faith that basically is the resiliency of religion, and where we care for our neighbor and we care for our communities, and I think that to me is the. Let me back up and come at it this way. There's a lot of people who are angry at the world, and they're angry at their governments, and they're angry at these institutions, and that's all we hear from them. And I don't believe that they're very helpful, and they're not contributing to making things better. And what makes things better is what you were describing, which is acts of grace, where we care for our neighbor, we care for the institutions of, local institutions. And to me, the trick is, how do we help people feel not so much responsible, but that they feel like they're a participant, have a meaningful participation in their community.
Yep.
And that they have something to contribute, and that there are people there who will say thank you for your contribution. Yep. And that's where I think we have a lot of work to do. I choose to work on that end of things rather than as the critic of the systems that are out there. I mean, they're worthy of all the criticism you can muster, but that's not going to help them. They're gonna go away. They're going to morph into something else. But what we really need is the kind of thing you're doing, which is let's take care of each other. So how does a person living in Toronto do that today? What's going on in Toronto where those kinds of shall we say anarchic, but rather than anarchism, but anarchic resistance to control take place so that people can be cared for?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Toronto is a tricky one. I mean, on the positive side, Toronto is an incredibly diverse city. Like, I think there's over 200 languages spoken in the city. You know, my daughter's classmates, I think 3 of her classmates have both parents born in Canada. Like, there's just a wild range of experiences and cultures to draw upon. Which provides just this real diverse set of sort of ontologies that we can imagine into the systems that we develop. I'll also say that Canada is a lot more ordered and structured than the U.S. system. Like, we rely. I mean, you know, it's peace, order, and good government, right? This is the foundation of our system, and so we tend to have a more of a deeply burned in trust of institutions, which can make it hard to set up systems that are outside of that.
Yeah.
But I'll say is the connections. So, like, some of the work we did, we were involved in this thing called Maitri, and the Maitri platform is about 100 of us. Early days of COVID, we're like, all right, response to COVID is not going to be equitable. Like, we know this. Like, the race for resources, the race for supplies. And so this is a group of 100 people around the world that were like, all right, let's do what we can to support equity in response to COVID. And you know, we got involved in a bunch of things. We turned a textile factory by one of our members, like his family owns a number of clothing factories in India, over to PPE production and got them like export licenses. We discovered that, like, you know, sleep apnea, they had those machines to help you. They can actually be used to treat folks with like fairly developed COVID in settings where there's no electricity, because they can sort of be manually operated. So and there's thousands of these things in warehouses because they're like last generation. A lot of them in Boston, and so we helped some people to source that and then distributed them. Did a lot of fundraising activities for communities that were like struggling to access. And so I think that the fact that as a hub, we're connected into all these sort of diasporic communities and connections that can provide sort of this remote access. So it's like a web almost, as opposed to like a center of activity. Not to say there are people in Toronto doing amazing work around sort of mutual aid and reciprocity. That hasn't been like my focus so much. But the connections that become available and the speed that trust can sort of move out is a lot higher, just because of the sort of the makeup of the city and the community that we're in.
So once COVID was over, how did these relationships respond to moving into a new era?
So, and actually, it's a good question. Like, a lot of the group are working on, you know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and mostly dealing with folks that a lot of students that didn't have any rights to sort of claim status in the EU. They were being sent back, and so dealing with those folks, often from East Africa. Others were involved in sort of other disaster responses. The sad reality is that, you know, that the need for these types of things doesn't end. Some is more infrastructure based. So a few of the folks are really interested in insurance. There's a model, because with the heating that's happening, insurance companies can actually save money by prevention, by paying out on claims like prior to an event, so that people can get the supplies they need to weather the sort of the climate emergency. And so dealing with some of the logistical issues around that, because we have a lot of folks that are sort of connected in insurance companies and international finance and places like that. For us, it was culture. We're really interested in the relationships, like the close connection between Kenya and India, and when different waves were hitting each area, like India being the pharmacy of that part of the world and the world generally. And so how do you ensure that when a local crisis doesn't cascade out to become a much broader crisis? So, but yeah, and then a lot of our work, at least at UKAI, was around loneliness. We created a map called New Not Normal, where folks could sort of tag how they were feeling somewhere in the world. And then we were highlighting projects where people were addressing loneliness during COVID, and the need for that hasn't gone away. Loneliness remains an epidemic, especially in Canada, and so that's some of the priority and the focus right now.
It's interesting. I just reposted this morning a post from last year or last February or January. I guess it was January, on how not to be normal, and I think that's the call to be creative and take initiative and look to do what you can for your local community. And you don't have to do a big thing; you can do a small thing, But the cumulative effect of each person doing something is tremendous, and it's
a signal, right? Like one person does something and you're like, oh, I can do that. I don't want to do that, but I want to do something like that. And
you hear a little story and all of it, you're moved by that, and you say, well, I can go do that, and then you invite someone to join you in that. I mean, this is the way the network effect begins to happen when you're not looking to the institutional structure to give you the signals as to what you're supposed to do.
Yep.
And then
that learning is hard, right?
It's very difficult, particularly because the world we live in has been so organized around the institutions as being machines, and we're all cogs in the machine. So that's this is why I feel like we're at a transition point, not just in modern history, but in human history, and that what's going to emerge is going to be something very different than what even 3,000 or 4,000 years ago they would have expected, because that hierarchy of power is more difficult to maintain now than ever before. And that's why the distributing power, decentralizing power, I think actually makes sense for the future. And typically we move towards what makes sense. We may go to it being drugged and screamed into it. We may be grousing and complaining about it, but ultimately that's where we find ourselves, I believe.
Well, I think that, so one of the people I interviewed for this is with the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and he says that one of the biggest things to deal with in an emergency is like people's level of thinking. Because if they're cognizant of themselves, they'll act rationally to serve themselves. But if they're at the level of family or level of community or level of even larger system, then different decisions become rational. And so part of it, he says, is inviting people to sort of, elevate's the wrong word, right? But to kind of like get a little higher up and say, all right, this may be good for you, but is this good for your family? Is this good for your community? Is this good for your city? Is this good for your, and the work is to get people thinking at those levels.
Well, it's broadening their perspective, perception of the world. And I and the more of us that do that, the better things will be. And so tell us tell us more about this book, in particular, your methodology or the reason you did the book as the way you did it, because you've got little things like little blotches here and there, and you got lines, and you've got this strange cover, and then you're not selling it except through your own organization. Yep. I have copy 190. I mean 130.
Yeah. Oh, you got 150. Congrats. That's a good number.
135. 135.
All right.
That's 135 out of 500.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, I wish I could say, okay, some of the things, the design, I was gifted with an absolutely amazing, stunning collaborator, Noor Bishotti, who is just a brilliant person and helped a ton with that work, and who's maybe sitting next to me right now. So I have to say nice things, but no, and so I'm absolutely blessed to have a wonderful community of collaborators, but Noor has been absolutely incredible. In terms of selling, that's just my own ignorance. Like I wish I knew better how these systems sort of work. And it's been great. Like the book has been moving and we're building a community around it and things like that. But I don't have a desire to sort of sell it through Amazon. I haven't really had a desire to sell it through, through sort of larger sort of bookstores. Um, if anyone watching this wants to help me do that, I would be very appreciative of that, but it is not where my expertise sits. For me, the opportunity to write the book was, I felt a real need to get something out, and to make sense of the work that I'd been doing, and to really ground it in ideas that have been sort of there and percolating, but I wanted to put in the time and effort to make them solid, to reify them in some way. And yeah, and that's and we do some publishing at UKAI, but it tends to be these types of small runs, like 300-400, based on projects. And so I think I'm probably imitating how we've traditionally done it. I think if I were to go back, I would probably do it different. We did have a publisher that was interested, like a larger distributor and publisher. They really wanted it to be about AI, because there is a chapter about AI in there, and that's fine, but that wasn't really the book I was interested in writing, and I am interested in AI, but it's not what the book was about. So that ended up not coming to fruition. But yeah, that was sort of the mechanics of production.
Well, I'm enjoying reading it, and we'll put a link in the show notes so that people can find it. It's sort of like reading conversation. And I like that. I mean, and because it has a flow to it, it has depth to it. I think all of those of you who might be interested in it, I think you would like the book, and I think it would be well worth your time to purchase it and read it. Not just purchase it, but read it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, one of the motivations was my family lived in Windsor, just across from Detroit, and would go at Christmas, and my family would have very sort of thoughtful conversations about the world. My grandfather was the head of the Chrysler Union there in Windsor for a while. My grandmother ran for political office, so like it was, we those conversations were happening, and I was trying to capture a bit of that spirit. They sort of different ideas flowing into each other, and yeah, a conversation that feels like a really, yeah, I like that description.
You succeeded. Well, Jerrold, thank you for joining us today, and this has been great. I appreciate what you're doing. I wish you well, because I think what you're doing is not just important, but it's an example of what other people can be doing, and I think that's for all of you who are living elsewhere. I think that's what you should hear, is that a lot of these people that I'm interviewing here are examples for us to follow. And that's not to say that they're superheroes or anything, but they're doing things. They've taken initiative. They're doing things that make a difference and are going to have a lasting impact upon their communities. And so there's no reason why you can't do that either, if you just decide that that's where you want to go. So thank you, Jerrold, for what you're doing and for being with us today. And thank you all for watching the Eddy Network podcast today. And please subscribe, hit the like button. And if you have a comment or a question, please offer that, and we'll certainly be in touch with you. So thank you again, Jerrold, and we'll see you.
Thank you very much.
See you all real soon. Bye-bye.